Imagine you're in the front of a large dugout canoe on the broad Putumayo River in the Colombian jungle, in the South American jungle. It's hot on the water, very muggy, so muggy you can smell the humidity. There's jaguars and 22-foot anacondas in the jungle on either side of the banks. It's dangerous out there, and that's where I grew up, because my parents were missionaries. They moved down there in 1960 to translate the Bible into the Siona Indian language. And they raised 6 kids. I was the oldest. We spent most of our time going back and forth between the jungle environment and Loma Linda, a missionary community in central Colombia where maybe 300 Americans lived. Now at Loma Linda, we had a nice brick house with most of the amenities you have in the States, like electricity and, we had running water, but not hot water. We laughed at the people who needed hot showers because it was really too hot to need hot showers. But in the jungle, we lived in a thatched roof, bamboo walled house upon 9-foot stilts in case of floods, just like the Sionas did. And our house there had no electricity and no plumbing. So one day, probably sometime in the late 60s, I can't remember exactly when, I was probably 8 or 9 years old. My brother Bobby was a year younger than me. He still is, as a matter of fact. We decided that we were tired of using an outhouse, having no plumbing and no electricity. We decided to build our own house with real plumbing and real electricity out there in the jungle. Now, that was the first time that we'd ever been given our very own machetes, because we were big boys now, not like our little brothers Frank and Jim. Now our dad showed us how to use a big flat rock from across the river on the sandbar to sharpen our machetes, to do something with rocks other than throw at our little brothers. So we went round and round with our machetes on that rock, trying to sharpen them. We got tired of that pretty soon. We wandered off into the jungle in search of something to cut down to use to help build our new house. We wandered past a couple of saplings, decided they weren't nearly big enough. We actually despised them because they were way too small, way too skinny. The stilts needed to be as big as telephone poles, as big and sturdy as telephone poles for a house like what we were going to build. We went through the jungle and just wandered through the jungle, always on the alert, of course, for jaguars and anacondas that might drop from the trees on us. Calvin and Hobbes had nothing on us. We were prepared to take on 100 jaguars or maybe 500 anacondas with our new machetes. Funny how I don't remember seeing a single jaguar or anaconda that entire stroll through the forest. I do remember having to squat beside a tree to do my business, only I forgot to get a leaf to clean myself with. I had to holler out, "Hey, Bobby, can you get me a leaf?" All the time thinking that, well, maybe he's trying to decide whether he's going to get a nice, smooth banana leaf or a nettle. He decided to be nice to me that day. So we kept on strolling through the forest till we came to our favorite climbing tree. Now this was a huge tree, 12 feet around. It grew straight up about 15 feet before it started branching out in all directions. And it had the best shade leaves, big flat leaves, and it went up another 20 feet. You had to use a small tree up to the side to climb it because it was so big around. Now some days we spent the entire afternoon in that tree, just eating grapes. It was a fruit very much like grapes, actually, but maybe not quite a grape, but it was really delicious. Sometimes we'd spend hours in that tree, and our mom would not understand why we weren't hungry for any dinner. Except for today, Bobby and I were almost ready to climb that tree again, and we realized, oh yes, we have our machetes in our hands. We're here to get building materials for our new house. We took a look at the tree, and we looked at each other, and we nodded, said, yes, this tree, this giant tree, is the only tree in the entire jungle worthy to use to support our new house. So Bobby got on one side and I got on the other, and we started chopping at it with our machetes. We chopped and we chopped and we chopped. We had to take a break after about 5 minutes because it was such hard work. I went around to the other side to check out Bobby's progress, and it wasn't much better than mine. We looked at each other and realized we'd have to scale back our operation a little bit. So then we wandered back through the jungle, found a few saplings. Half hour later, all the saplings were still standing, and we were starting to get a little dejected. We really wanted to build that house. We found ourselves right on the edge of the riverbank, looking at a whole stand of reed-like plants, about 8 feet tall, about as thick as my thumb. We looked at those, and it was sure a depressing thought, thinking that we'd have to build a house out of that. But we really wanted to build that house. Oh, we could bundle a whole bunch of them together and use a whole bundle of them as stilts. So we looked at each other with shining eyes and started chopping down a whole bunch, and we dragged them all out in front of our house. Our house in the jungle stood about 50 feet back from the bank, and we dumped a whole bunch of them out about 5 feet from the bank, just all over the place, because we were going to use a whole bunch of them to build our house. First the stilts, and then the rest of the house. So we had our machetes, and we started pacing off a little area about 5 feet from the bank, not realizing that it might cave in, that kind of thing, but that's okay. We were having fun. We started digging a little bit into the dirt with our machetes and realized these machetes are really like little shovels. I started flipping some dirt at Bobby, and he flipped some back at me, and pretty soon we were digging to beat the band in a hole digging contest halfway to China. Now, about that time, my dad came out to take a look at what we were doing. We were starting to dig holes, and he wasn't sure if that was a good idea, but he spent a few minutes walking around, looking at what we were doing, observing our holes, and looking at all these reeds just scattered all over the front yard by now. Not saying a thing. Well, I was doing pretty well with my holes. I'd already dug 3 holes pretty deep, almost 6 inches deep, and I was getting ready to start on my 4th one when my dad finally asked what we were doing. I was shocked because I thought it should be obvious what we were doing. I said, Dad, we're building us a new house. Yeah, with real plumbing and electricity, said Bobby. Yeah, duh. My dad said, plumbing? And I said, yeah, we're going to use a bamboo pole for the plumbing, straight down here in the middle. See, a bamboo pole grows about this big around, and they have sections about this long, about, maybe 2 or 3 feet long, and each one has a very thin membrane between them. So we were going to hollow it out, just poke through the membrane and use it as a big pipe. And it looks like a big pipe out of a pipe organ. So I was going to plant it right here in the middle, surrounded by a few of the reeds, and that would be our plumbing right in the middle of the house with a middle stilt. My dad took a look at that and said, well, it's going straight down into the dirt there. What happens if it backs up into the house? And I thought for a second, thought real fast, and no, we're going to dig it a lot deeper than that, all the way out into the river. And he said, the river you swim in? Well, Bobby jumped in before I could get too embarrassed, and he said, yeah, and for the plumbing and for the electricity, we thought we'd use some of the batteries you use for your two-way radio. You've got a whole bunch. My dad used about 50 batteries, 50 flashlight batteries for his two-way radio, for the two-way communications between Loma Linda and us, and he had a whole box full. We figured he had all kinds of batteries to spare. Well, my dad just kind of looked at that and said, And the way he said that, we realized that we weren't going to be able to power the refrigerator we'd envisioned. But before we got too embarrassed about that, my dad started changing the subject. He says, these holes the dirt around here on the bank is kind of soft. How about if you use some rocks from the sandbar across the river to help make it more solid for the stilts? We thought, oh, yeah, another way to use rocks. So we carefully put away our machetes and picked up our paddles and went running down the bank. It was a 20-foot bank all the way down to the water to get our canoe. It was a dugout canoe, about 12 feet long, about this wide. I could sit in the back so I could splash my brother a little bit easier with my paddle. And we started paddling all the way across. Now, this canoe sat very low in the water compared to the canoes we have up here. About halfway all the way into the water. Now, this was nothing compared to what some of the Sionis could do. They could fill their canoes all the way up so that they only had about 2 inches of freeboard, and then get in on top of that and paddle all the way across the river with that. They used their canoes kind of like we use trucks sometimes, pickup trucks. So every single time we got in our canoe, we always wished that we could do it like the Sionas did. So we paddled across the river. It's 200 yards across. It's a big river. And you have to paddle 45 degrees upstream to be able to get all the way across without getting pushed all the way down by the current, because the current is pretty powerful. Till we got all the way on the other side, and we could start to paddle upriver in the slower part of the current, all the way up the side of the sandbar, till we got to a place where there were some rocks. We dragged our canoe all the way up on top of the bank, on top of the sandbar, right up next to a bunch of rocks, and started piling rocks into the canoe. There were a whole bunch of rocks about the size of my fist, and we filled that canoe all the way full. And it wasn't until it was that full that we realized that we couldn't budge it after that. We tried to push it back into the water, and it would not move. We tried digging holes underneath the canoe to push it, and tried to put rollers under it, but nothing worked. We were just so dejected. We finally just rolled the canoe over and emptied all the rocks onto the sandbar so we could get home before dark. Now, we never did finish the house we were trying to build the way we wanted to build it. It was, I think we managed to get a couple of pretty cool lean-tos, though. But those were the kinds of adventures we had out there all the time. Sometimes we'd wander out into the jungle and we'd run across one of the Sionas, or maybe we'd paddle upriver to visit somebody, and everybody lived in houses maybe a quarter mile away from each other, up and down the river. It was real country out there with jungle everywhere as far as you could see. We'd visit some of the Sionas, and maybe one of them would be smoking some meat, or maybe somebody else would be making a hammock out of string that they'd made. They just rub the grass on their thighs to make some really nice string. And they'd dye it and make it real pretty, and the hammocks would be really strong. Or carrying baskets that they could put around their foreheads and carry all kinds of firewood, all kinds of things from the jungle. One of the guys had such big calluses and hard calluses on his feet that he could sharpen his machete on the bottom of his feet. But we had lots of those kinds of adventures out in the jungle. And my parents always encouraged us to really be thankful for the way we were brought up and for the experiences we had, and to carry that sense of adventure into everything we did, everywhere we went. I do that today, and I use that sense of adventure and sense of looking way outside the box, the kind of box that we normally think of in this country, to be able to solve problems in lots of ways that lots of people don't do out here. But that is the start of a whole other series of stories.